In the interest of time, I will go ahead and allow us to transition to the second panel, which is Texas and the North American Energy Region. Our moderator today is the Honorable Victor Carrillo. A native of Abilene, the Honorable Victor Carrillo is President and Chief Operating Officer of Zion Oil, a publicly traded E&P company with operations in Israel. He is also a practicing petroleum geologist, geophysicist, and attorney. At this time, he also sits on the board of Magnum Hunter Resources. He has over 20 years in the industry, and Mr. Carrillo has also given back to his community, serving first as Abilene City Councilman, then moving up to Taylor County Judge, and as a member of the Railroad Commission of Texas for 8 years. He earned his bachelor's degree in geology from Hardin-Simmons University, a master's from Baylor University, and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Houston Law Center. He also holds an honorary doctorate from Hardin-Simmons Orden in May of 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Carrillo.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay. It's good to be here with you today. I hope you've enjoyed it so far, and I hope we can add to that enjoyment. Whenever someone introduces me as a practicing attorney, I tell people I have a law degree, but I'm actually a recovering attorney. So don't get it confused. Our topic is Texas and the North American Energy Region. So we're going to talk about the U.S. and Texas in particular, and its role with Mexico and Canada. So the three countries together, we're going to talk a little bit about that with these experts here. And those three countries, our three countries, are, in my opinion, just blessed to have been endowed really with a wealth of energy resources. To varying degrees, each has developed those resources in different timing with different expertise, etc. And so we're going to share a little bit about that and speak, hopefully, to issues of energy security, energy independence, or energy interdependence, particularly with regard to importing and exporting. We'll touch on those topics. So I'd like to start first by introducing Steve Mollina here to my left. Steve is of counsel and has an international and domestic energy practice with DENTONS US. You may know them as SNR Denton formerly. He's a University of Texas Longhorn undergrad and 1974 SMU law grad. And let me give you some other information about Steve. Formerly, Steve was general counsel for Oman Oil Company. He was chief counsel for ARCO Latin America in Venezuela and had worked for ARCO for many years before that. He was general counsel for Benton Oil and Gas and Vastar Resources, both E&P companies. He's a Texas member of the International Oil and Gas Compact Commission. He's vice chair of the Foreign Affiliates Committee. He's a board member of the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce in D.C., and he chairs the Mexican Energy Reform Committee. He's also senior advisor to bilateral U.S.-Arab Chamber in Houston. And a little known fact is that Steve's daughter Kay was my chief of staff for several years when I was at the Railroad Commission. So let me start first. We're going to start talking about Mexico. And you heard Jordi Herrera this morning speak about Mexico and the really monumental start of reform with the constitutional changes that occurred last year. And recently, regarding Mexico's historic energy reforms, in a speech at CERAWeek in Houston, in fact, earlier this week, Pemex CEO Emilio Lozoya said, quote, "I think we should aspire to have hundreds of companies present in Mexico, partnering with Mexican capital." And you heard some of that this morning. He said, "The reforms need to address the paradox that Mexico has abundant reserves," which we know to be the case, but very high energy costs, and then you heard some of the other issues that were brought up this morning. Let me give you just a few more facts about Mexico, then I'll ask Steve his first question. So over the last decade, Mexico's oil production has dropped about 20%. And you heard this morning that as of last year, they're producing about 2.5 million barrels a day in the last quarter of 2013. Compared to Texas, we are now producing in 2013 2.6 million barrels of oil per day. Pemex, as you heard, plans to boost capital spending to $28 billion this year and is encouraging companies, and you heard him say Texas folks in particular, to come and be a part of this new era in Mexico. So my first question for Steve. As one of the first lawyers to engage Petróleos de Venezuela in their opening of the oil and gas industry to foreign investment in the mid-1990s, you were an eyewitness to the process the last time a major Latin American country attempted what Mexico is attempting. What do you think about the Mexican situation, and do you feel that they're ready, that now is the right time?
Thank you, Victor. Is this thing on? Okay. Very quickly, I just want to tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in Mexico City. I moved there when I was 12 years old, and I left at the end of high school. I went to American school. I actually met my wife in the 5th grade there, and she was much more accomplished than I was. I'm still surprised that she married me. But so I have a background in Mexico, an earlier Mexico, granted, but I feel sort of a relationship with Mexico and always have. When I took Mexican history in school, the law required, even though I went to the American school, that half the day had to be taught in Spanish. So I took Mexican history in Spanish. And strangely enough, I also took American history in Spanish. But I'll never forget that part of the teaching, part of the curriculum, had to do with the takeover and expropriation of the oil and gas industry, and I think it was 1937. And that was a big deal when I was a boy. And it was sort of taught in the way that the foreign investors were gone. We've reclaimed our national heritage, and they weren't coming back. And it was sort of an evil that had been eradicated. Now, I'm one of those people from the early days. I never thought the Mexican oil and gas industry would open up because of my background. And I was, right up until they did it, I didn't believe it was going to happen. But they did. And I think they did it out of necessity. I don't know that anybody realizes this, but they're the last country in the world to open their industry to foreign investors. They held on longer than anybody. How the government managed to convince generation after generation after generation of all living Mexicans that to do a 180 on this issue, the president just did an unbelievable job in selling this. But anyway, that's my background. And I had the occasion last year to visit with the general counsel of Pemex, through a mutual friend. And we visited for a while, and once he found out I'd been in Venezuela, he was very interested to know the problems that Venezuela had, maybe the mistakes that they'd made. So we talked about that for a couple of hours, and then I went back a few weeks ago and spoke to two gentlemen at the Secretary of Energy's office about the same topic, and because the General Counsel of Pemex had recommended that they talk to me about Venezuela. And before I got out of town, I received a call from the CNH, and they said that the Secretary of Energy's office had called them and told them that they needed to talk to me about Venezuela. So I stayed over an extra couple of days, and I've had a lot of discussions. And I've got some observations. This whole thing is moving very fast in Mexico, and I think somebody alluded earlier to the timeline and whether it was realistic or not. I'm not going to suggest that it's not realistic, but like most politicians, the Congress wants everything done. You know, they waited decades to get this done, but now that it's done, they want it done, finished yesterday. You have to realize that unlike Venezuela, which expropriated the oil and gas industry in 1970 and still had a few older generations of people that were used to dealing in the international oil and gas markets with foreign investors, Mexico doesn't have that. They would have to go back to 1936 to find anybody that had firsthand experience in dealing with foreign investors in the oil and gas business. And obviously that's not realistic. The learning curve is tremendous. In visiting with all of these agencies, they're anxious to learn. They realize that they have a big learning curve issue, and that they're being sort of thrown into the international oil and gas industry, and it's a sink or swim sort of a situation. So I'm just going to mention a few of the things we talked about. They weren't confidential. I used Venezuelan examples over and over again. They have a lack of international upstream E&P experience. Now, don't get me wrong, Pemex knows a lot about exploration and production, but they don't know about the international E&P business. For example, I doubt whether any of the people I've talked to so far down there have ever seen a joint operating agreement. Now, anybody here that's in the oil and gas business is going to be taken aback and say, what do you mean they don't understand an oil, the relationship of the joint operating agreement? Well, why should they? They've never had to use that relationship. Pemex has always had a monopoly on everything. They don't have partners. So they have to get over that hurdle. And they have to not only learn to read a joint operating agreement, they have to understand the relationships in the joint operating agreement, because they're going to have partners in a joint operating agreement going forward. So, in fact, I actually sent them the AIPN model form joint operating agreement, which everybody now uses, and it's we had it translated into Spanish, so they had the Spanish version, and they're very thankful to get that. But the point I'm trying to get at is there's a huge learning curve, because if you've ever been involved in a bid round in exploration and production, you're familiar with the documents and the data packages and everything else. They've never had to do that. They've also got in my opinion, a consulting problem. There are people all over the world that can tell them how to do it, can sit next to them and show them how to do it. And I'm sure they're going to hire consultants. But first of all, they can't turn to any Mexican, I'm going to use law as an example. They can't turn to any Mexican lawyers because there are no Mexican lawyers that are familiar with what I'm talking about. And why should there be? They've never had to do it. So as close as they're going to come are people that say, well, I dealt with foreign investors in infrastructure projects, I did this and that, but they've never dealt with exploration and production. So they can't look at their own base of Mexican lawyers to get that experience. If they turn to the international legal community, 99% of them are going to have conflicts of interest. They represent the oil companies. They'll be representing the people that come into Mexico. And I mean, which side of the table are they going to sit on, the Mexican side or the major oil company side? So they've got a very limited number of people that they can turn to for this kind of advice. And I think they're struggling with that. Now, don't get me wrong, there's all kinds of people down there with a hand out right now. It's like sharks circling a boat. They're all trying to get on board and do something. But in the legal area, it's going to be very, very difficult because there are not that many people that are going to qualify. Another issue we talked about for a while is where Mexico ranks. The government take is very important. I've sat through enough executive meetings, especially in international, where you're trying to decide what your rate of return is. And each country decides what the government take is going to be, the taxes, the royalty, the bonuses, and everything else. And some are up in the 90 percentile range, and some are down in the 20 percentile range. It sort of depends on how competitive you are and what your reserve base looks like and your political risk and a whole lot of other things. I personally think that Mexico is going to be right near the top. You look at their reserve base, you look at their political stability, you look at their geographic location, the southern border of the United States. I mean, this is a no-brainer. This is where capital is going to be drawn to. The only thing I see sort of pushing in the other direction would be if they got very unrealistic on the government take and tried to get up in the 97, 98 percentile. And I think that may have happened in one of the earlier bid rounds or service contracts. I think they were very disappointed in the results because the government, and I think the reason was they expected people to come flooding in there when the government take was unrealistically high. They didn't realize that all the oil companies that have, like Exxon, that look all over the world, they rank their projects. And government takes a big part of that. So that was an issue we discussed. Another one that I think a lot of people in this audience are going to be impacted by is local content, and the labor laws, work permits. Mexico has a very, very sophisticated legal system when it comes to these two issues. When I was a boy, my father was president of the Ford Motor Company in Mexico, and he and Minister Salinas, I think, I like to say, sort of built the automobile industry in Mexico. But my dad ran into these two issues back in the late 50s. Mexico has a very, very sophisticated oil and gas industry. So when it comes to local content, I would expect the numbers are going to be high. It's going to be very difficult to import a lot of materials into Mexico if they're manufactured in Mexico. And work permits. You're not going to be able to just flood the country with American executives, workers, whatever. You're probably going to have to turn to a local labor base. And so those are two issues that you're going to have to confront right up front. And you've just got to remember they've got a very, very sophisticated oil and gas industry in place. Another issue that we discussed was the timing of the regulations. I think it's going to be a mistake if the Congress and Mexico they decide how they're going to do this and they pass the regulations. And then they turn to the business issues and the contracts and the bid packages and things like that. Venezuela made that mistake because it's very, very difficult. Once they see what business environment they put themselves in, they say, well, we shouldn't have done that, or we shouldn't have passed a regulation, or we have to tweak it a little bit. The problem is it's very difficult to go back to the Congress and get these things changed. So you almost have to get it done right the first time. And they're moving so fast, and I think it sort of looks like they, change the Constitution, change the laws, get the states to agree, pass the regulations, and then let's worry about how we do this from a business perspective. I think it's very, very important that they understand the business of international oil and gas investors and investment before they pass all the regulations and sort of paint themselves into a corner. The last thing I'll say is a while back, and I don't know if he's still there, but there was a vice president for E&P of Pemex that came out with a press release that Pemex was coming to the United States and that they were going to buy a company and they were going to start doing what everybody else does in the United States, looking for oil and gas as a sort of a partner, private investor. I'm going to go on record as saying I can't imagine that'll ever happen. I can't imagine with all the opportunities that Mexico has with their own reserve base that they're going to come up here and take that kind of risk and start speculating like the rest of us do in the United States. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I think they've got plenty of work cut out for them in Mexico.
Thank you, Steve. You heard Mr. Herrera say this morning that he feels this is Mexico's last big chance on this whole topic. And he said that, I think his last slide was that the Texas experience for Mexico is the key to their future in the energy sector. So let me mention a few facts of Texas, and then we'll go into visiting with Stan Jumper. So for those of you who don't know, Texas is still the #1 oil and gas producing state in the nation, in the United States. And in 2013, Texas oil production approached 1 billion barrels. It was 941 million barrels of crude oil. And that's the highest annual output for oil since at least 1981. Texas oil production has more than doubled in just the last 3 years. And if you look at the chart of production from, say, the 1981 to 2000, it was a pretty precipitous drop, and then it kind of flattened out for several years. And then just in the last several years, since 2009, 2010, it's an exponential curve that's going almost straight up. Both the Eagle Ford and the Permian Basin oil fields in Texas are now producing 1 million barrels per day. And in 2013, Texas supplied about 34.5% of the nation's oil. So with Texas as Mexico's northern neighbor, one would expect that Mexico would want Texas E&P companies and expertise to be some of the first to come over to help replicate some of that Texas success in Mexico. So I want to turn now to a Texas E&P company's experience operating in Mexico. So let me introduce the next panelist, and that's Stan Jumper. He's Executive VP over exploration and development for Lewis Energy Group, a Texas-based company. Rod Lewis is the founder and CEO of that company. He's a wonderful guy who really built Lewis from one well, and I'm going to ask Stan to elaborate a little bit on that story. But Stan is a certified petroleum geologist. He received both his MBA in geology, master's in geology, and MBA from here at Southern Methodist University. He's a member of the Houston Geological Society. He's been with Lewis Energy Group since the beginning, since its founding, actually choosing the location of the first successful well in 1986. Before then, he worked with Union Oil of California and Clint Murchison Jr. here in Dallas. He grew up in East Texas, and in his bio, Stan says he was captivated by the colorful characters he met in the oil and gas industry, and he knew at the tender young age of 8 that he wanted to be a geologist. So Stan, first, will you share a little bit with us about how Rod got into the oil business? I think it's a great story. And then as a follow-up, Lewis Energy, I know, has operated, one of the few companies from the U.S. that has operated in Mexico for over 10 years, I think in the Burgos Basin. So please share with us some of your experiences there, some of the problems you experienced as an operator, some of the other issues, and I'll let you go on.
The first thing, just to correct, I got my master's in geology at Texas Arlington, but I did get my MBA from SMU, so just for all you Maverick fans, clarify that. In 1982, I worked for Murchison Exploration, and we were drilling in Webb County, Texas. And we had our first successful well, and we hired a gauger named Rod Lewis to gauge our well. His company consisted of him, one other gauger, and his wife. It was interesting when back in the days of pre-technology, when you would go evaluate a well as a geologist, you would be out there for 2 or 3 days. And every time I went to log a well, Rod Lewis would show up on location and stay in this tiny logging truck with me for 6-8 hours. I'd go back, and I got a call from one of our engineers and said, I've got this guy named Rod Lewis who wants to come out and watch the well being drilled and the well being completed. He said, is that okay? And I said, sure, he actually works for us, and you just don't know it. Well, that kind of showed the interest that Rod had in learning the business, and he would learn the industry any way that he could, and it was primarily a hands-on experience. And in 1986, our drilling had slowed down, and he came to me and he wanted me to, he drilled a few wells, and I was impressed that this guy that was a gauger had raised money to go drill these wells, but they weren't successful. But the cost that he was drilling them in were significantly lower than what we were at Murchison. So I had a little dilemma. As I felt I had a nice field, we were spending too much money. So I asked Rod, I said, well, let me pick a location. I'll convince the company to farm out a location. And that's when we drilled our first successful well in 1986. Our management was so impressed, they reached an agreement with him to where he would farm out the rest of the acreage we had in South Texas. The one caveat, I would do pick the locations. So he and I started working early on, and to fast forward to 1992, he was drilling a well a month. 1994, he sold half of the company. He had a partner, and he and the partner had divergent ideas of where the company should go. We worked in a part of South Texas that most people didn't want to operate. Fairly low margins, and you really had to work on controlling cost. His partner kind of wanted to drill more glamorous wells than what we were drilling. So he bought his partner out, went into the pipeline business, and he knew early on that the only way that we were going to survive in these areas of very limited return, and they were unconventional plays even in 1992, because we were fracking our wells that far back, is that you had to control as much of the expense line that you could. So 1996, he bought his first drilling rig, and to give you an idea of where we are today, we own 20 drilling rigs. We're currently drilling with 10 rigs in the U.S., 2 rigs in Colombia. And our production has grown from 0 to 500 million cubic feet of gas a day and 20,000 barrels. And he is truly a self-made man and has devoted his life to his company. As far as Mexico, we became involved in a multi-service contract over 10 years ago working in Mexico. Strangely enough, Pemex actually came to us. They looked at the border in the U.S. and saw this company drilling on the U.S. side right adjacent to Mexico in a formation that they saw there's no way that they could make economical. And Rod was very nice. He invited the Pemex people into our South Texas office, showed them what we were doing, and right about then, the first service contract were being made available, and they encouraged us to come and participate in the round. And so in that first bid round, we received a block called the Almost Block, which is about a 100,000 acre block. And we started our first drilling in Mexico over 10 years ago. And I will tell you, it's quite a challenge drilling there. And you alluded earlier about the problem with the service contracts, is that making money off of those contracts were just exceptionally difficult. And that was the reason that there were not a lot of companies that bid. Most of the companies that did bid were national oil companies. I think there were a couple of Brazilian companies, a Spanish company, but they were fairly large companies, and most of them backed out, after the first few years. Rod's deeply devoted to South Texas. He has his heritage is Spanish. I know you may know that, but and he believed in, and he still does and believes in Mexico. So he always felt at some point energy reform would take place and the industry would open up. It just happened candidly a lot quicker than what we thought. But he felt like we'd have a big advantage in that we would at least know how operations take place in Mexico. And so one of the things, I'll disagree with slightly, there are people in Pemex that do operate with other companies. We work with some of these guys on a very regular basis. When we first started, it was quite confrontational when we would go meet with Pemex, because candidly, they didn't want us there. Most of the rank and file people didn't want us there. And so over a period of time and adjustment, and fortunately, that they had brought in people outside of Pemex to be directors of the company, they opened up and we started having a very good dialogue with the country. The problem that you have in Mexico is that there are very few wells drilled. The cost of drilling in Mexico is extremely high. And here we are operating on the U.S. side, and we go to Mexico, and we feel like we really know what we're doing, and we're spending twice the amount of money to drill a well in Mexico it is in the U.S. And we really pride ourselves on being a good, low-cost producer, because the type of wells that we drill necessitate that. And so when you have to look at the factors of what's causing these high costs, and any operator that goes over there for a period of time are going to have to deal with these same issues. Most of the areas will be remote. There aren't other wells around you. There's a tremendous lack of service companies there. There are just a few companies there. It is extremely expensive. If you want to cement a well, you want to perforate a well, it's very expensive. Our equipment we brought in from the U.S., so you have to import the equipment into Mexico. So you deal with a lot of issues that you don't have to deal with in the U.S. side. Infrastructure. We had a discovery. There's no pipeline. So it took 3 years. We ended up laying a pipeline to connect our line in the U.S. It took 3 years in an international treaty to get a pipeline before you could sell your gas. And that will take place onshore throughout the country as things go forward. Geologically, and that's kind of my background, so I'll be a little biased here. It's much more complex in Mexico than it is on the U.S. side. You know, we focus on the Eagle Ford and those shallow upper Cretaceous sands. Most of the things that we do are called extensional plays. Relatively simple in terms of structure. In Mexico, you don't have to go very far, and you'll see a big mountain chains crossing the Rio Grande, and that adds an additional element in terms of structure, timing, and migration of the hydrocarbons, the cooking of the hydrocarbons. So just because you have production in the U.S. doesn't mean you can jump the river and think that the same thing is going to happen there. You know, we operate 5 wells in the Eagle Ford, and I'll tell you that Pemex has drilled 5 other wells, and they've reported these results to other companies, to the industry. And what you'll see is very erratic results, and to date they're very limited. So it certainly doesn't mean that they're not going to have successful Eagle Ford plays or Pearsall or what other type plays, but the key in our industry, working unconventional plays, is repeatability. You've got to be able to repeat them, and time after time, that's how we economize. So there's going to be big learning curves associated in working with the company. And one of the things Victor and I discussed is like some of the issues that you will deal with as working in Mexico that you don't have to deal with in the U.S. So one of the first issues is security. In the U.S., we go stake a well, we send a guy out to stake a well. And in Mexico, you have to have a security team, and they have to coordinate with local officials and federal officials. You know, if you don't do things right, it is dangerous. We've never had an issue with our operations in Mexico, but Pemex has issues with stolen crude. It's talked about it. You can go to Stratford and see some of the issues that recently came out. So as an operator going in there, you're going to have to put a security team in place. Doesn't mean that you can't do it, but things take a lot of planning. If you want to perforate a well, which requires explosives, you want to core a well, you just can't call Slimmers out and say, I want to go perforate this well. You have to coordinate with permits with the military to be able to coordinate in those type of activities. So from an operations standpoint, I tell people it is different. The rules, they're writing their rules and regulations. Currently, we have to operate under what Pemex tells us, or their regulations. And they're much more onerous in disposing of cuttings. Even if it's freshwater mud, you can't dispose of cuttings on the site. You have to go to cuttings farms. Casing programs are different. Labor, you brought labor as really interesting. You have labor is there are labor unions. Your workers have to be organized in a labor union. So in the U.S., I doubt very many people have had to deal with crews where you have to have everyone has to be represented by organized labor. So those are some of the issues that people are going to have to deal with going forward.
Good. Stan, as you discuss that, I think you've opened my eyes to some of the problems that your company has experienced and what others might expect. And as you described that drilling a well in Mexico may cost twice or even more, and the specific problems, it harkens back to my experience in Israel, where it's probably about 4 times the cost, and those very same issues that you described are present over there. So it's kind of surprising to me, but something that everyone here in an E&P company who might be interested in pursuing oil and gas production in Mexico needs to be very well aware of. So we've been talking about our southern neighbor. We're going to shift focus and talk about our northern neighbors, Canada. So let me first introduce our third panelist. It's Commissioner Paul JEAKINS. He's Commissioner and CEO of British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission. We've known each other for several years. We both served on the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, along with Steve as well. Commissioner Jeakins is a native of Vancouver, British Columbia, graduating from the University of Alberta in 1985 with a bachelor's degree in forestry. He also holds a Master of Science degree from Royal Roads University. And prior to joining the commission in 2006, Mr. Jeakins was a partner in a resource consulting firm. His roles at the commission have included Chief Operating Officer, Deputy Commissioner of Regulatory Affairs and Stewardship, and Manager of Audits. But in 2011, in October of 2011, he accepted his current position as Commissioner and CEO, where he is the strategic and operational leader of the commission. He brings over 30 years of expertise to the role in organizational leadership, regulatory, and strategy planning, decision-making, and financial management as well. He's a board member of the Petroleum Technology Alliance of Canada and vice chair of CAMPIT's Energy Resources Committee. I didn't know what CAMPIT was, so I looked it up. Canada's Energy and Utility Regulators is an association of Canadian, federal, provincial, and territorial regulatory boards and commissions. These boards and commissions are responsible for the regulation of the electric, water, gas, and pipeline utilities in Canada. So if you learn nothing else, you learned what CAMPIT is today. He's based out of Victoria. He divides his work time between the commission's offices in Fort St. John, Dawson Creek, Fort Nelson, and Kelowna. I haven't been there, and he regularly travels to Calgary. So, Commissioner, thank you for being with us. You've probably come one of the longest distances, I guess.
Took 8 hours to get here, yeah.
Share with us your thoughts on British Columbia in particular, but really in the broader context of Canada in general. Production, Canada's role as a part of the U.S. and Mexico in sort of a three-country energy alliance, and just share with us more about that, will you?
Sure, great. Thanks, Victor. And I really do appreciate coming down here, especially since Texas started this big hoo-ha-ha with shale gas that we are now living in BC specifically. I can give you a bit of context on Canada. I'm a British Columbia regulator, so I'll focus a little bit on what we're doing in British Columbia. But Canada's got natural gas and some oil potential right from the Arctic to the Pacific to the Atlantic. 70% of all of our natural gas production anyway comes from Alberta, but 25% comes from BC. So you can see that there's a lot of potential in the other provinces as well. Right now, our country's the third largest producer of natural gas in the world, and we're sixth in oil production. Obviously, our exports to the U.S. are our biggest market. We're seeing declines in that now in the east specifically, as we see things going on in the Marcellus. In fact, some of the gas from the Marcellus is now going north into Ontario, so that's a big shift for Canada. So we're obviously looking very closely at LNG, and it's something that's we're very bullish on in BC. We've got many companies, large majors, super majors in BC right now kicking the tires as to what it could look like for LNG. So we've got a lot of plant companies in there internationally from the U.S. We've got a lot of pipeline companies as well looking at it. Just to narrow in a bit on BC, we've got about 2,900 plus TCF in 4 shale basins. We produce about 4.4 BCF a day natural gas. We don't have a whole lot of oil. We let Alberta and Saskatchewan have the oil. One of the interesting things for us is we shifted from a 90% conventional natural gas province to a 90% unconventional province between 2007 and 2013. And in 2007, I remember when one of our geologists sent around an email basically saying, this is a complete game changer for us, and we didn't really know what was going to hit us. So we looked immediately to what was going on in Texas. And the conversations back then were specific around water use. It wasn't the whole water chain. I'll get into that in a second. But it was about water use. Oddly enough, sand. It was about the big thing about sand needs, because we didn't have any sand. And then on something called horizontal drilling, and it wasn't something that we normally did in BC. And then we saw what was going on in New York State around hydraulic fracturing. So immediately we started to look with the IOGCC at what they were doing with frac focus. And so we developed our own version of that for Canada. And BC started that off, but we've now got Alberta, Manitoba, and I think Nova Scotia's on there. Our federal National Energy Board is also participating in frac focus. We made it mandatory. I know it was voluntary in the US when we started, but BC made it mandatory, and I think the other provinces are also making hydraulic fracturing fluid disclosure mandatory as well. So the issues that Canada's dealing with related to the development of natural gas in our province are exactly the same issues that the United States is dealing with. You know, safety is always number one, but for us, what we're doing in BC now, as we've learned this over the last couple of years, is we're updating our regulations around hydraulic fracturing. So a few things that we're looking at specifically, and this is going to be put in place by October, so we're working on it, you know, diligently right now. Induced seismicity. You know, as soon as we heard about induced seismicity in Oklahoma, it was in our paper, you know, the next day. Our media, it was immediate. Anything that happens here you know, we hear about instantaneously. So we had a bunch of earthquakes or events up in the Montney, up in the Horn River Basin, and so we work very closely with our federal counterparts, with the companies to look at what we should do around induced seismicity. We've been using conditions in permits right now to this point, but since they're consistent, we want to put that into regulation. And then groundwater monitoring is another aspect that we're seeing as an emerging issue, so we're now putting that into regulation as well. The other thing that we're looking at pretty closely, and it's directly related to that shift to unconventional, is quality of life benefits. So I know that's something that is discussed down here quite a bit. You know, again, we've got, you know, not as many people up in the northeast part of our province that Texas certainly has spread across the state. But things like increased and longer term traffic is a very big issue for the people living near oil and gas. Dust issues, I'm sure you're dealing with that. Visual quality is now something that's come up quite a lot in conversations with landowners, noise. All those issues that are, you know, people's quality of life, we want to make sure that we're looking at. We don't want to necessarily regulate it at this point, but we certainly want to see some improvements as to how we deal with those things. We're certainly working on all aspects of water management now. It's not just about finding enough water. We've got lots of water in the northeast of the province. We can prove that. We've got all the science we need to prove that, although we'll still take, you know, people coming in saying there's not enough water, whereas we can show it. I don't know if it's the same down here, but when people want to talk about water, they talk about Olympic-sized swimming pools of water use for hydraulic fracturing, so that's a hard one to counter. So we're modeling potential sources. We're looking at the whole infrastructure of water handling, whether that's injection, you know, at the end, because we do a lot of injection in BC, or just storage. You know, we've got open ground storage for a lot of frac fluids right now. We even had what we thought initially was an explosive device go off in one of our storage ponds, and luckily the crew had a camera on their rig at the time, and so, because it happened at night, so everyone was investigating somebody throwing a stick of dynamite into one of these things. And I mean, we're talking the north of the province, and it turned out it was a meteor. So we're going to regulate that. The other thing that we're doing is transparently reporting out on everything, as much as we can. If you go to our website right now, you'll see quarterly water reports, you'll see quarterly compliance reports, you know, what companies are not compliant. We're reporting out on pretty much every facet that we can come up with as a regulator. And as a regulator, I've been watching with fascination the discussions both in Canada and down here in the US on the topic of whether it's social license or stakeholder engagement. You know, as I said, every jurisdiction is linked. If it happens here, we hear about it there. And that is the next day. So within that context, as a regulator, again, this is just my perspective as a regulator, we've got to take a fairly broad view across a larger area than an individual company does when they talk about social license, when you're trying to talk about what's the right way to develop something. So, you know, we are looking at multiple tenures, we're looking at multiple projects, and again, many companies, and our tenures are you know, fairly small, up to a few thousand hectares. So our approach is about working with communities, have to be fairly inclusive across a very large area. Our shale basins are anywhere from about 700,000 hectares up to 3 million hectares in the Montney. So we're looking at actually managing at a tactical level on that level. We're looking at stepping up above an individual application. So we have conversations, whether it's with our First Nations or Aboriginal communities, with local residents, with companies, with other government agencies for that matter, at a fairly broad level. We started with a 1 million hectare basin, the Liard Basin, which is near the Horn River, if you've heard of the Horn River Basin, sort of up near Northwest Territories, Yukon border with BC. And we worked with Apache and a few other companies in that area to come up with what a tactical approach, an area-based analysis approach would look like. So we've developed a map, we've developed a report that shows areas that you just can't go in. There's Class A parks, there's riparian reserve zones, there's areas just by law you're not supposed to go in, and we show those. If you look on our website, there'll be a big red blob on the map. You just can't put an application in there. Then we work with companies, with our First Nations, with local stakeholders on best practices, so that we have the best practices. And we definitely look to Texas, to other states, even Australia, New Zealand, as to what's going on to develop those best practices. So companies are heavily involved in those. And again, they're not regulated. Those are just the practices we expect. And what that means is an application coming into us, if you're following the practices, would go through routine. If you're not going to follow the practices, and a good reason for that, then it would just go through non-routine. Takes a little bit longer for us to review it because you're going to use different science, different perspectives. And then there's just a green area on the map, which is follow the fairly robust laws that we've got. So that's a way we're sort of starting that conversation with a variety of different groups. The other thing we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the best science to bear on this. So we did a survey a couple of years ago through the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And we asked them, we asked the university to ask a number of questions. So they did all the questioning across the province, and they did all the analysis. And one of the questions we asked them to do was on a trade-off. So we forced trade-offs between things like drinking water quality and maintaining environmental values. And the analysis that they used was not just a ranking of 1, 2, 3, 4, but a relative importance. And maintaining drinking water, #1 across the entire province. I mean, by a large margin. #2 was the environmental values, the surface values. #3 was quality of life benefits. And #4 was how much water people are using for hydraulic fracturing. There's a bunch more on the economic trade-offs as well. But one of the other questions we asked is who do you trust? Who do you find trustworthy in the conversation about hydrocarbons? And #1, oddly enough, for a university study was the universities. So universities, #1. But what was very interesting, unfortunately, industry was kind of not even on the chart. But then it was elected officials as last on the chart. Then it was government, I guess, bureaucrats such as myself. But up in the #2 category were experts. So I guess people that are seen as experts that are outside of academia. But then it was environmentalists, environmental non-government organizations. It was the internet, and it was your friend. So if you've got a Facebook friend who works for Greenpeace, who self-declares as an expert, that's who people are going to trust. So for us, we took all of that information in, and that is very much how we're approaching the development of natural gas in BC. And we're seeing that in other provinces in Canada as well. So, as companies are proposing now large pipelines from the northeast part of our province, where most of the upstream activity is, across the northern part all the way to the coast, 900 to 1,000 kilometers, to get to the LNG plants, the proposed LNG plants, it's a different type of conversation now. So it's a different terrain, it's different communities, different First Nations certainly. And then as we got to the LNG discussions, again, for the most part, our upstream companies are, we have some Texas-based companies operating out of Calgary, but the people we're seeing now on the LNG front are different. When we talk about Shell, it's not the Calgary Shell people necessarily, it's the Hague Shell people. And, it's a different perspective that our province has to deal with. So it's certainly ramping up the conversations on a number of fronts, and certainly ramping up the timelines. So everyone's very aware of the LNG opportunities in the world, and again, we're looking Asia Pacific rather than over towards Europe. But the timelines on that are very critical. And so our government has been moving very rapidly to make sure that, you know, we're not a hindrance, we're not a roadblock, but we're still doing it appropriately, we're still talking to all the people. So that's just a real quick overview of what BC, a little bit on Canada, is doing and how we're definitely closely linked to the rest of North America.
And I'm sure we'll hear more on Canada as a whole.
In the paper, probably.
Here in a bit, certainly. But one of the things I really appreciate about some of my Canadian colleagues when I was at the Railroad Commission and through IOGCC is they recognize, this is my perception, recognize that the various provinces of Canada to different degrees are also very blessed with natural resources. But as opposed to over-regulating for the sake of regulating, it's a responsible regulation that allows the jobs to come, that allows the monetary rewards, economic benefits to come. And so I really appreciate that about most of the folks who I've gotten to know from the Canadian provinces. So again, I appreciate you being here and discussing that with us. I know we're probably short on time. Okay, so I'm really just going to ask maybe one or two questions, a little more broad, I guess. And since we are talking about these three countries, I want each of you really just to share with me a little bit about your thoughts, and wherever you want to take it, but on what does it mean to you to be energy secure as a North American entity? And can we achieve, as an entity, not just the U.S., but three, Mexico, U.S., and Canada, energy independence or energy interdependence? And one last comment that I'll make before we go to that is most people don't know that when the U.S. imports oil, a lot of folks think it's the vast majority would come from the Middle East, and that's not the case. In fact, Canada and Mexico are huge suppliers of crude oil to the United States. So I can't think of two better neighbors to be in an alliance with for North America. So with that, I'll leave it at that, and whoever wants to take it first. You want to start, Steve?
Yeah, I had the privilege of getting involved with the Oil Council at their Houston Assembly 2 years ago. And I sat on a stage like this in the wingback chair with Pete Olson, who's from the Texas 22nd District, U.S. Congress. And I was supposed to interview him. And he's on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is, you know, in the federal government, that's what regulates oil and gas. And I asked him this question. I worked it out with him ahead of time, so I didn't catch him cold. But, so he had a chance to think about the answer. I said, if we encourage the importation of Canada's Alberta oil sands petroleum, which some argue is now outlawed indirectly, cooperate closely with Mexico on its development of its natural resources and infrastructure, and fully develop our own shale gas resources, shale and oil gas resources, can we actually achieve energy independence and stop relying on unfriendly regimes to supply our hydrocarbon needs? Are the reserves actually there? And his answer was an uncategorical yes. And he said, and everybody on the committee knows that. And then we, of course, got into the discussion as well, okay, great, we're energy independent. Why do we choose not to be? Politics, environmentalists, special interest groups, it's sort of the usual story out of Washington. And so when people talk about becoming energy independent, we're already energy independent. If we would partner up with Mexico and Canada, the three of us could be net exporters of oil and gas, and it would probably hurt the Middle East quite a bit, and maybe Venezuela and other countries, you know, so what? But I think it's what I'm trying to say is I believe we are energy independent, and I think it's a self-inflicted wound.
You know, we'll look at it from a producer standpoint a little bit differently. And I think for the U.S., the critical thing is going to be price of natural gas. And, you know, currently, the problem, there's a limited demand for natural gas. Exports are going to be absolutely essential, because when natural gas prices rise slightly, there's an increase in drilling, and we go right back, there's no increase in demand. So from an administration standpoint, the encouragement of natural gas vehicles, things like that would really help move in that direction. You know, the problem I see is I see an administration that really doesn't want more use of of hydrocarbons. So I think we have a challenge ahead of ourselves, but the first thing is to get the exports of LNG.
On that topic, before I turn to you, you heard this morning also that Mexico imports natural gas. I think it was 1.4 BCF, but they're expecting that to double and even more so in the years to come. So I know for Texas producers, that's a remarkable opportunity to export to our neighboring country.
Well, it's, both in terms of exporting and in terms of operating within Mexico itself. One of the things I failed to mention is that, these plays in the Wilcox and Yewa and Vicksburg, all of those plays literally go up to the Mexico border and are relatively underexplored or unexplored in Mexico, and there's no question the reserves will be there. So if they, I think from Mexico, it's critical that they look at every area perhaps independently. Your price regime that you're going to charge that they'll be able to extract from offshore, where you'll be looking at billion-barrel fields, have to be significantly different than a shale play or a tight gas play. So I think Mexico is, if they're willing to be flexible and do with some type of, Colombia has recently gone to a bid situation to where they allow the companies basically to dictate the royalty. So if they'll do something like that, I think each area can be unique. And certainly from a natural gas standpoint in Mexico, they will alleviate quickly their problem.
Commissioner?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. If the numbers don't show absolute independence right now, I think there's no reason we can't be as a continent. We're so linked, as I said, we've got BC Alberta gas coming to the U.S., we have U.S. gas coming up to Ontario. We've got one company proposing an LNG facility in Oregon that wants to use BC and Alberta gas. Yeah, we're linked. There's no reason we shouldn't be linked. We're linked beyond the hydrocarbon economy into trade and security on a number of fronts. So I agree it should be a continent-wide solution.
I'm going to wrap up with one final comment. Stan mentioned that as you go from Texas into Mexico and you have the river in between, that the resources are underneath the subsurface. That river does not divide the geologic resources underneath. And I recall when I was at the Railroad Commission looking at a map with all the wells in Texas and all the wells in Mexico, and the contrast is incredible because they stop there, but it's not because the resources aren't there, it's because Mexico has not had the opportunity and pursued those to the same degree that Texas has. Same is the case up with Magnum Hunter, and we're up in the Bakken of North Dakota, and in fact into Canada, and the resources are the same. That border does not separate the resources. So I agree with all of you guys that if we're not actually energy independent now, we're certainly very close, and with a little effort and continued goodwill, that we can be a powerful force in North America and really globally. So let's thank these three gentlemen for their time here.